Good morning, and thank you for that intro. And we also see guys that have popped a walk-on pen through their nose, so you don't ask to borrow their pen. It's great to be with you again this morning, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to bring another look at missions through the organisation that we represent, Ethnos New Zealand. You might recall from our last visit here that our long-term goal is a thriving church for every people. So that is all about reaching the ethnic people of the world, the ethnos, and for those who have little to no access to the gospel. So that takes living amongst them, learning their language, bringing the message of Jesus, and then staying long enough to see a church reach maturity. So this is long term. Part of Judy and my full-time ministry these days is to bring an awareness of missions and mobilising to missions. And during the course of this, a couple of years ago now, we met Mark, like you heard, from when it was over at Kaipaki. So you've just heard how God has been working in his life and the path ahead for him. This has been an exciting ride for Mark so far, and Judy and I have been privileged and excited to be a part of that with him while in Papua New Guinea last year, and also to see firsthand how the Lord was opening Mark's eyes to a future service with him. For those of you who don't know what kick-started this, Mark already mentioned it about interface, but for those who have not seen anything of it, here is a small glimpse into what this looks like in Papua New Guinea.
Interface is a short-term mission program held here in Papua New Guinea. It's run by Ethnos 360 and global partners like Ethnos New Zealand. It's designed to show young adults why we need long-term missionaries.
A lot of these things that Jesus has commanded us to do they take life-on-life discipleship for years.
Interface is a 6-week tertiary level course in church planting among ethnic people groups. It includes time in the classroom, learning the principles of tribal church planting, how to learn an unwritten language, courses in translation principles, as well as classes on finances, support roles, and cultural awareness. There are classes in Pidgin and loads of opportunities to practice with national people.
Well, here at ITF, we teach the Bible chronologically, just like we do out in the bush locations that we're at. And a lot of people ask, well, what's chronological teaching? Well, quite often you hear the chronological teaching called the creation to Christ story, which is great, but it's much broader than that. It does story all the way from creation to Christ, but it actually starts before that and goes beyond that too.
This man who just came to our village, and he's taught me how to read, he's taught me how to write, and he's taught me the true word of God. And to see the joy in her face, that was my favorite memory.
One of the highlights of Interface is the side trip to a tribal village to see a young church plant. That's a whole week with a new church, hearing their stories, worshiping with them, and just experiencing life out in the bush with them. It's a pretty full-on week. You might be thinking, I could never do something like that. Well, maybe you can't, and that's the point. With God's help, we can.
I would just love to continue to encourage the guys to step up and be men, and who knows how God's going to direct, but getting them over here to see a picture of what God is doing to reach the unreached as men.
Experiencing Interface may show you that you have an aptitude for languages, a heart to build relationships with people from a different culture, or show you how you could fill a vital support role.
For every single one of these church planters, there is another support missionary behind them, trying to keep them fed, keep them healthy. That are doctors and nurses, trying to provide guest housing for them when they do come out of the bush, consulting with them, that'd be the translation and the language consultants. There's an enormous support structure that's required. So we need support missionaries on this field too. Love it if you consider where God might use you and your gifts.
If God has given you an interest in missions, Why not come and experience firsthand church planting in some of the most isolated areas of the world?
Come, please. It's so fun. It's so worth it.
So interface is a fantastic way to see what God may have for somebody else here, and it really shows if missions or ministry is something that God would have. This year's program is full. Maybe there might be a space to squeeze another young guy in, but you have to be real quick. The girls are always quicker. We always get more girls than guys, so that's why we have it there. Come on, men, step up to it. Come and talk to us afterwards and we can tell you more, and simply grab hold of Mark and ask him. He'll tell you plenty. When he came back from Interface last year, he was so fired up that Natalia, his sister, began to inquire about this. And what he had shared, as well as the Holy Spirit working in her life, she has now signed up to go this year with us. So, like we did for Mark, we have made some prayer bookmarks for her. They're on the back table out in the other room, and also you can find out a bit more about Interface with that card as well. For Judy and I, we love to see the Lord working in young lives, how He's drawing the next generation to serve Him. To do this, we share about missions all around New Zealand, and we offer to do so in many different ways. And so to cast that net wide, far and wide, there's been times I've been crazy enough to suggest that, well, I could fit a missions message into whatever the church is sharing at that time. And one time I had a church say, yeah, we can do that. We go through the book of Joshua, chapter by chapter. You can speak into chapter 21. Chapter 21, what's that all about? No way. It is about allocating 48 towns for the Levites, all listed out one by one. So what on earth was I thinking to make that kind of an offer to plug into somebody else's series? How does that on earth fit into Ethnos' vision statement, a thriving church for every people? Or how does that fit into any of the reasons that any local church comes together week by week? So come with me and let's find out in what I have titled Scattered to Bless. And we're going to uncover this from a chapter that is so easily overlooked because of its many lists. But like what happens so often in Scripture, we are blessed if we dig down deep. And I sure was blessed enough to modify that and bring that here this morning. So now let's get started with a little bit of context. Chapter 21 concludes the settlement process of Canaan. The land has largely been conquered and now divided out among the tribes, as you can see here on this map. And as you look at that, you'll notice there is an absence of territory assigned to Levi. So this follows God's directive, as Moses records for us in Deuteronomy 18:1. The priests who are Levites, indeed the whole tribe of Levi, are to have no allotment or inheritance with Israel. So that is the background to jump into chapter 21, and now let's start reading from verse 1. Now the family heads of the Levites approached Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the heads of the other tribal families of Israel at Shiloh in Canaan, and said to them, the Lord commanded through Moses that you give us towns to live in, with pasture lands for our livestock. So this is no angry demand. They're just stating what God had promised them back in Numbers 35, verse 28. So continue in verse 3. So as the Lord had commanded, the Israelites gave the Levites the following towns and pasture lands out of their own inheritance. And so then when you get to verse 4, all the way down to verse 42, we find all the towns listed, and here you go, there's a representation of all 48 of them. And like many Hebrew lists, we may have to read it and reread it a few times before we can get our Western minds around what's been communicated through it. See, the first thing we need to grip hold of here is in verses 4 to 8 is how the Levites are divided through Levi's 3 sons, Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. So that's 3 sons, but the tribe is divided into 4 groups. So how does that work? So a careful look at verse 4 reveals that the Kohathite clan was divided into 2 groups. Priests descended from Aaron, and then the rest of the non-Kohathite priests. And then with the Gershonite clan and the Merari clans, that's how the Levites are actually divided into 4 groups. Each is allocated their towns, and verses 9 to 42, we get all the detail, name by name, of all those towns. And look at all those names. Now this is the sort of list you get your youth group to read as a race with a mouthful of dry wheat bits. So try that when you get home tonight. But this list is important because it forms a legal record of all the allocated towns for the Levites. But now if we step back from all of this, we're also going to see that this is a new beginning for the whole nation of Israel. For the first time in their history, they now have a place to call their own. Within around 50 years before this time, their parents' generation were slaves under a tyrant Pharaoh in Egypt. And then because of that generation's unbelief, this next generation bore the consequences by becoming nomadic desert dwellers. None of them, except Joshua and Caleb, are older than around 70. The huge majority of them were born in the desert, and now here they are, fulfilling God's promise to their ancestor Abraham, almost 700 years, a land of their own. It's also a new beginning for all the Levites. For them, during the years of the desert wanderings, they had their place in the camp, all grouped tightly together surrounding the tabernacle. Now the tabernacle was in the center of the Israelite camps, and the Kohathite Aaronic priests, they were camped at the eastern front of the tabernacle. The rest of the non-priest Kohathites, they were all on the immediate south side. The Gershonite clans were alongside the western wall, and the Merarites were on the north. So this had the Levites all tightly clustered around the tabernacle. This is all very practical for them, for their duties of service and their responsibilities to move it and its furnishings when they travelled. But now that they were in the land, the tabernacle was permanently standing in Shiloh. So this greatly reduced their workload, since they would no longer be needed to pull up stakes and move it like they did during their wanderings. So here's the question. Why would God change the order that he had previously established and now scatter them amongst the tribes? So let's look at 3 reasons. The first is prophetic. A fulfillment of prophecy made by Jacob some 450 years earlier. In Genesis chapter 49, when Jacob had gathered his sons around his deathbed for his final farewell blessing, it's more of a curse that he pronounces for Simeon and Levi. You see, earlier on in Genesis chapter 34, there is the account of their massacre of the men of Shechem. And it's to this that God calls into account through Jacob when he says, their swords are weapons of violence. They have killed men in their anger and hamstrung oxen as they please. Cursed be their anger, so fierce, and their fury so cruel. And because of that, here it is, I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. So this is what we could call the forgotten reason or a consequence why the Levites were scattered. And as a side, you'll notice on the map that there is no allocation of land to Simeon. As we are 1 and also 19 verse 9, Simeon's inheritance lay within the territory of Judah. So this is a good reminder to us today that nothing gets forgotten by God. All kinds of injustices abound, weapons of violence and wars and senseless invasions, biological gender that's becoming hamstrung to please a wicked and adulterous generation, the fierce and cruel killing of thousands of unborn. We can be sure that none of that and more goes unnoticed by God. Justice will be served because mankind is accountable. 1 Peter 4:5 could not be clearer. They will have to give an account to Him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. Now, not just the overt wickedness we see of the ungodly, but us as believers, we too must guard against that covert wickedness that works in our earthly nature. In Colossians 3, Paul doesn't mince his words as to what that is. Sexual immorality, impurity, lust, evil desires, greed, which is idolatry, anger, rage, malice, slander, filthy language, lying. Because of these, the wrath of God is coming. You used to walk in these ways in the life you once lived, but now you must rid yourself of all such things. If we don't, as saved people at the Bema judgment seat of reward, we will be brought to account on those things and we will suffer loss. So let's get back to the Levites. Realising their own lack of their own territory, it would have been easy for them to grumble and complain. Remember, the Israelites are well practiced at that. To grumble and complain about the fact that they were scattered. Why them? They were the ones who aroused God's wrath all those years earlier. And we too can look at the lot that we have in life when we compare ourselves to others and think that God is unfair or that we are living somebody else's consequence. But like one commentator has said, if we can get our head around what is going on here, it liberates us and will prove to be a blessing to us and to those around us. Instead of questioning God's purposes, we can delight in serving Him where we are at. If we dig down further in here, we find that it's the incredible grace of God at work as the main reason for their dispersion. And in only a way that God can, He brings good out of bad. He didn't flip-flop on what was prophesied through Jacob, but He turns that situation around to bless Israel. And that becomes the basis for the second reason to scatter the Levites. It was substitution. They had become the adopted substitute for the firstborn of the entire nation of Israel. God speaking to Moses in Numbers 3:12 and 13 says, I have taken the Levites from among the Israelites in place of the first male offspring of every Israelite woman. The Levites are mine, for all the firstborn are mine. When I struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, I set apart for myself every firstborn in Israel. So, as a representation of all the firstborn, God had given the Levites positions of service for His purposes and for His glory. And so now, and here's the blessing, by being scattered, they would be accessible to positively influence those that they lived amongst. Moses, in his final prophetic blessing of the tribes, says of Levi, he teaches your precepts to Jacob and your law to Israel. So this was now their new upgraded responsibility, to instruct Israel in the law of God and to maintain a knowledge of His word among the people. Someone has estimated that no one in Israel lived more than about 16 kilometres from where one of these Levite towns was. Therefore, like my Bible knowledge commentary points out, every Israelite had nearby a man well versed in the law of Moses who could give advice and counsel in the many problems of religious, family, and political life. So therefore, potential for good among the tribes was almost unlimited. Now this is similar for us. That is a great picture of the church's responsibility for outreach, for discipleship, and for missions as we are scattered amongst the world. As Christians, we, like the Levites, we are well versed in more than the law of Moses. We have the gospel of grace, and our potential for good among those around us is almost unlimited. But that does mean that missions and evangelism is to be scattered outside of the church, not like the old model of the Levites all clustered around the tabernacle. You see, if we stay clustered around the church, it's going to be harder for us to reach the lost. If we stay clustered around the church, we won't even know that there are those out there asking to hear about God. In Papua New Guinea in 2017, our ethnos missionaries planted a church among the Iski people. Soon after that sparked a continual stream of delegates from a neighbouring people group, the Kaminimau. Now they don't speak the Iski language, but month by month through interpreters, they requested missionaries to come to their village, learn their language, and teach them God's story. They did that for 5 years. These people were asking because of the difference they had seen that the gospel had made when it took root in the lives of the Iski people. As the Iski church matured, in 2022, our missionaries were finally able to survey this need with a view to send missionaries. As they hiked through each village, they said, we were greeted by countless people with fruits, tobacco, and betel nut. So that's your traditional tribal gifts. These people would express to us through an interpreter that they are scared and do not know where their spirit will end up when they die. Who will tell us God's story? And indeed, who will? It will take someone who is scattered to bless these people or others like them, and that's what God is asking of Christians all around the world. Just our organisation alone has people scattered through 33 countries, like you see here. This is why Peter talks about us becoming like aliens and strangers in the world. And in 1 Peter 2:9, he says, you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. So this is why ethnos New Zealand, we are looking for those from this royal priesthood who are willing to become aliens and strangers in the world, to go and serve in missions. When we lived and served in the Philippines, we were forever reminded of this when we had to renew our visas at the Alien Control Office. Seriously, that's what they called it. And our kids had great imaginations of little green guys with 3 eyes and antenna sitting behind the desks. But it was us that were the aliens in a foreign country. It's the alienation to missions that saw us leave a successful business here in New Zealand to become career missionaries, however it was that God chose to use us. And that happened to be starting off in a jungle tribe in the Philippines. And that was our amazing house for many years. Now today we are based here in New Zealand as we lead, as we administrate, as we mobilise people through ethnos New Zealand. It's this alienation to missions that sees the likes of Mark that we recruited, who has given up a life here that he could make for himself as he prepares to head over to our missionary Bible college in Waukesha, Wisconsin, America. This will be Mark's home for the next couple of years, amongst more than 100 other students, mostly of similar age. Looks like a castle on a hill, and you will be well looked after. Maybe you might even get some occasional preferential treatment, because we have another Kiwi who heads up the kitchen staff. Helpers, full-time missionaries, those who work away in the background, church planters, Bible teachers, these are all desperately needed. We are in a real desperate need for a doctor or two, some teachers, many other professions or trades. People are needed as well. Maybe there's somebody here. It just starts with, how can I help? Or maybe you know somebody that might be interested in this. Please let me know. Maybe you can pray that the Lord would bring those people across our path. Praying for them, and this includes Mark, for all the challenges they will face to get there, and then probably more important, to stay there. Then you can help by praying for the wide-ranging work that Ethnos is doing around the world. And being a church that is a sending church to Mark, you can definitely put him on your fridge or in your Bible as a reminder to pray for him. So we have cards out there, and Mark, I'll put a sheet out there. Sign up for his updates, and you'll get Ethnos ones as well that will tell you things that Mark will never tell you. And we can also give you these magazines. So there's a place to sign up out there. Our missionaries have to live strong and courageous, just like Joshua and his people. Now, this is not just missionaries, this is also for today's Christians living here in New Zealand as we watch it rapidly descend into greater depravity. What used to be the experience on the foreign mission field is now becoming commonplace everywhere. It is a hostile world with much blatant evil amongst those who have less and less knowledge about God. So whether we continue to live here or follow the Lord into a foreign field, it will be against the tide of personal pursuits. It isn't easy, and we can't do it in our own strength, nor on our own. And especially in missions, this is highlighted by the need for that wider team. And that leads to another reason why the Levites were scattered. It was all about provision. They were about the Lord's business, not their own. They could not support themselves in farming or any other industry like their brothers from the other tribes. Theirs was a ministry among their people, and it was those people that were to support them. Deuteronomy 18:1-8 lays out how God expected Israel to provide not just for the priests, but for the whole tribe of Levi. They shall live on the offerings made to the Lord by fire, for that is their inheritance. And those verses go on to list the parts of the animal sacrifices that were to be given to them, as well as the first fruits of the grain, the new wine and oil, and the first wool shorn from their sheep. And then the reason is given in verse 5. For the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all your tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always. And then in verse 8, they are to share equally in Israel's benefits. So this is why we see in the church today, where many have a paid pastor or two, supported by their people. And this is also especially seen in missions, but it comes with a twist, because in missions it is never the unreached who will support their missionary. The missionary is like a Levite, scattered among those that they are to reach, but sent by a local home church. But then because of the costs, and because most New Zealand churches are too small to fully support their missionary, that's why they need additional support from other churches and individuals. In most places where our missionaries work, they cannot engage in employment to keep themselves there. Firstly, it would be illegal. Secondly, their work is full-time plus. And third reason, God has made a way for more than just those who go to be a part of what He's doing through their prayers and finances, given as their sacrifice for the Lord's work. Back to chapter 21. We can't leave it with just the Levites and their towns, because in the last 3 verses, there's really a conclusion of where this whole book has been heading. The conquest, they conclude the conquest of the land, and could even be seen as a climax to the whole book. So let's read from verse 43. So the Lord gave Israel all the land He had sworn to give their forefathers, and they took possession of it and settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as He had sworn to their forefathers. Not one of their enemies withstood them. The Lord handed all their enemies over to them. Not one of the Lord's good promises to the house of Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled. And what strikes me here is how the Lord gave, and He gave, and He gave. Did they deserve it? No. And in view of God's holiness, neither do we deserve anything either. But God gave what He promised because His word is sure. He had sworn by oath again and again to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob, and then to Moses and to Joshua. And it all happened just as He promised. The language of those verses drips like honey. A sworn possession, settled, rest, enemies handed over, good promise, everyone was fulfilled. See, God did exactly what He said He would do in Joshua 1:3. I'll give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. And why wouldn't He? See, as David says in Psalm 119, 89 to 90, your word, O Lord, is eternal. It stands firm in the heavens. Your faithfulness continues through all generations. See, we're talking about God's character here. It's all about His faithfulness. And that's why all these generations later, we can trust Him in the midst of all that's going on around us here. And in whatever He's called us to do. We have Jesus' promise in Matthew 6:31 to 33. Do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first His kingdom and His righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Judy and I have personally seen the Lord provide everything we have needed for the last 29 years. With our ministry, it is impossible for us to earn an income. And month by month, we have no idea what will come in, but it has always been enough. There's been times where we face some incredible needs right in our face. Early on in our time in the Philippines, there was this young guy, JR. He was the son of a friend of Judy's, and he'd been knocked off his motorbike. And then because his family didn't have the finances, he was sent home to live the rest of his life as a cripple. His condition was appalling, and we were shocked that his was a fixable condition that just needed the finances for the hospital and for an orthopedic surgeon. So because of Judy's friendship, we felt convicted to help him get to hospital, even though we didn't have the funds, but trusted that the Lord would provide. By the time that hospital bill came due, we had received the exact amount from a friend in Australia who had no knowledge of what was going on. Right when we needed to make payment, God provided money. That's just one of many, many stories I could share of God's faithfulness that we've seen. If any of us are scattered to God's purposes, wherever it is, we can trust our faithful God to provide what we need. So as we conclude today, how do we personally, each one of us, see the faithfulness of God? How lived, or are we living to prove God's faithfulness in our lives? Or are we hanging on to our lives so tight that there's little room for Him to show? It's a growing process to see God's faithfulness reach full living colour in our lives. So the question is, are we growing and understanding more and more of God's faithfulness? And if we're getting older, can we say that we now own God's faithfulness from our own life experiences? The encouragement for us today, regardless of whatever we are facing, God remains faithful. Just like He turned those ancient consequences around to bring blessing through the Levites, we too are recipients of His grace, and we are scattered to bless others. And this is totally possible because of God's unfailing faithfulness. As we go home today, as we look at how we can bless others, we can do so by clinging to God's character and confidently living out what Joshua says in 1:9. Be strong and courageous. Do not be terrified. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. Thank you for the opportunity to share this, and thank you.